Friday. It's time for you to get in on the fun wherever you may be around the world. I know for some of you it's Saturday, but for us it is Friday. Get in the chat, twitch.tv/Major Spoilers. Of course, you're probably not hearing me if you're just... How are you going to be in the chat unless you're there? Malone is there. We'll get a few more people in. You were listening to the Legion Clubhouse, episode 53. You can go check that out at majorspoilers.com or find the Legion Clubhouse on Apple Podcasts and everywhere else that cool things can be found. Finally, Friday is being brought to you this week by Major Spoilers VIP and Patreon members from around the world. Head over to patreon.com/Major Spoilers. That's patreon.com/Major Spoilers. Find out how you can keep this show going and all of the shows that we do at the Major Spoilers Podcast Network. Again, patreon.com/Major Spoilers. It is Friday, May 24th, 2019, not 2018. I hope you're having a good Friday. Not Good Friday, though. That was a couple of weeks ago. How you guys doing? We're heading into a 3-day weekend here in the United States. Many colleges, universities, high schools, middle schools, grade schools have been let out for the summer, or they're hitting their graduation. And, well, the last, 6 months or so, I've been teaching some classes down at our university. Some video production classes, a business class. I have no idea why they were having me teach a business class. But I thought today that I would talk about why I don't like teaching. One of the things that makes me upset about teaching. And it's not the environment. You know, the university setting is very nice. It's not the lack of equipment. But I think, and I know this may sound like an old man grumping kind of thing, but I seriously think the quality of the student that you have in a class will make the class more enjoyable or less enjoyable to teach. And I know we could spend hours just talking about, well, college is so expensive. It's just a mill to generate sheepskin so people can go out and find jobs. And then what is the university doing to find jobs? We can talk about all that another time. But for me, one of the things that just, again, I'm going to shake my fist on the lawn. One of the things that irritates me about students in general is their lack of interest, right? I realize that when you go to college, there are some classes that you are required to take, and some of them may not be very fun. One of the hardest classes that I took when I was in college was a required course on beginning business law. And it was taught by a mean old woman. She was mean. She never let up on students. Once she found a weak student, she just picked on that student for the remainder of the class. You know, if you didn't do your homework, if you didn't come to class prepared and she found out that you didn't have an answer to a question, oh man, she'd keep coming back to you and embarrass the heck out of you through the rest of the class. Fortunately, I'm not that way. But everyone hated that class. Everyone was afraid to go to the class. But one thing that I did notice in that class is that there were very few absentee students. Students, even though they hated the class, even though they were afraid of the class, they all showed up to the class. They were all attempting to participate when the instructor called on them. And even though I didn't think I would have any interest in the class, at least I was learning things about torts and contracts and agreements and the legalese of business that I can still use some of that today. And even though I may not have liked the homework, at least I attempted it. At least I tried my best, right? But I don't know about you, but it just seems like I end up with students who are majors in a program who have no interest in bettering their skills as an editor, as a photographer, as a cinematographer, as a director, as a producer. A lot of them have little interest in pursuing improving that skill set, which I think is vital. And I know this sounds like a lot of echoing of things that have happened before. I mean, the reason why we had the Zach on Film podcast is because Zach hadn't watched all of these films, classic films. And for those of you that have followed Zach on Film, and you followed Zach as he's grown older, as he went through college and did his post-college work, you know that he's benefited from having that knowledge. And I've tried to have this conversation. I did actually have the conversation with students this last year because we were in an advanced video class, one of the classes I was teaching. And I brought up, how many of you have seen, Citizen Kane, a movie that I will always go to as a great lesson on stagecraft and cinematography and storytelling and the use of very special techniques to get the story across. But I've realized in talking with Zach and through Zach on Film that, man, if it's more than 20 years old, kids are probably not, students, I won't call them kids, students are probably not interested in seeing that. And a lot of them are that way. They're just like, yeah, it's an old movie. Who cares? But you're trying to teach them, learning these lessons of what your predecessors have done can help you be better going forward. And so I tried to this semester. Maybe I need to do something within 5 years. Because I brought up how many students had seen Pulp Fiction in class. I mean, Pulp Fiction, right? Quentin Tarantino, he's got Once Upon a Time in Hollywood coming out in July. Pulp Fiction, one of the most important films when it comes to indie filmmakers, because it really showed that you could have a breakout hit. You weren't going to be confined to art house cinemas. And of course, Pulp Fiction redefined how you could tell a story. What does character mean? Some of the language that would be acceptable in film. Not a single one of my students have seen that film. I was amazed. I played that, we use a lot of the things in Pulp Fiction in today's pop culture is still around. I asked them about La Royale with cheese, and they all looked at me blankly like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I had to cue up that opening sequence of them driving through California, through Los Angeles, talking about how things are different in Europe compared to the United States. Now, I had to stop it once they got into the building, because then the conversation goes in a very different direction. But I agree with Malone there. It's the worst of all is the indifference. Like, they don't care. But it's like, how are you going to better yourselves? How are you going to get a job? How are you going to make an impact in this industry if all you do is kind of shrug your shoulders and go, I don't know. I've talked to students that want to be journalists, that want to work in television news, and I ask them, what are the most important stories that you're looking at today? What's going on in the world? What is your take on this? What have you found out? I don't know. I don't read the newspaper. I don't watch TV news. And it's like, you're going into this industry. What? You've got to participate in this industry. And that is the thing that I hate the most when it comes to dealing with students is, as Malone says there in the chat, the indifference or the lack of enthusiasm, especially about a topic that they are in the major of. And I don't get it. Maybe you guys will be able to help me out there, but... And then, of course, on top of that, you do average to below average work. Average is a C, remember. Average is a C. And yet, students expect to get A's for C work? I'm paying all this money for tuition. You need to give me an A. No. You get the grade that you earned. And if you turn in C quality work, you're going to get a C quality grade. Oh, well, I hate this instructor. He's too tough. Guess what the real world is going to be like? You think I'm tough? When you get out into the real world, your job and the pressures from your job are going to be 10 times this. Go back and do this project again. Or here are the things you made a mistake on. Go and improve them. It's too much work to improve. Too much work to set up a light. Too much work to set up a microphone properly. And I got to tell you, that is something that can bring you down as an instructor. I love it when we get good students. And next week, I'm going to talk about what I like about teaching. But for now you know the 3 things that irritate me when it comes to teaching students. Going back to the Pulp Fiction, Malone says, wow, I think that the elevator scene is still one of the prime examples of modern movie dialogue. Yes. In fact, right now, I've watched that trailer for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood so many times. Like, the day that it came out, I bet I watched it like 20 times. And I was like, you know what? I want to watch all of Quentin Tarantino's movies before July rolls around, before this movie hits theaters, because I want to just be kind of caught up on some of the themes and the storytelling and some of the nuances that we see in Quentin Tarantino's work. And so I started with Reservoir Dogs. I posted there on Twitter, @MajorSpoilers, some of my initial reactions. But what's amazing, when you watch Reservoir Dogs, and then the very next night you watch Pulp Fiction, instantly things start to coalesce. Quentin Tarantino has a distinct style of what he thinks the quote-unquote gangsta looks like. The black suits, the thin black ties, the sunglasses. Both movies start in a restaurant with dialogue around the table, and both movies, Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, both start with Tim Roth at the table having food and having a long conversation. You start to see some of the themes and elements, like certain characters. I mean, even though Steve Buscemi is a major character in Reservoir Dogs, he actually appears in Pulp Fiction as Buddy Holly. And we start to see Quentin Tarantino start to recycle a cast of actors that he really likes to work with in these first 2 movies. Harvey Keitel is in both movies. It's fascinating. And just Reservoir Dogs alone, if you've never seen that and you're interested in how do I stage a scene, how do I stage actors for good composition, watch Reservoir Dogs, because it is just like a masterclass in how do we stage people in a bare room to make it engaging and make it flow. It is so cool to watch that. Now, then I watched Jackie Brown last night. And the interesting thing about Jackie Brown is now we're still carrying over characters from the previous movie in the form of Samuel L. Jackson. We get Robert De Niro in instead of Harvey Keitel. I think Harvey Keitel would have been a more interesting character to have instead of Robert De Niro. We also see that this is not written by Quentin Tarantino. It's adapted from an Elmore Leonard book. So you kind of know how Elmore Leonard books go if you've seen any of his other stuff like Get Shorty, or read any of his stuff like Get Shorty. And it's fascinating. And you start to see how he goes from, late 80s, early 90s, late 90s, or I'm sorry, late 80s, early 90s, late 90s, by the time we hit Jackie Brown. The next film that's rolling out is Kill Bill Volumes 1 and 2. And it's going to be really interesting, again, because this is when we see Tarantino start to switch to his current cinematographer, and we're going to see how that plays out for all films going forward. But it's just fascinating to see these little things like the Madonna references, the foot references, the foot fetishes starting to pop up in the films. And it happens a lot, more than once you know that it's there, you can't not see it in those films. But in order to understand the film, in order to appreciate the film, you kind of got to watch the films. And if you're going to have a conversation with other people in the industry, and we've got Once Upon a Time in Hollywood coming up, people are probably going to want to have a conversation with you about other Tarantino films. And if you want to be in this industry, you probably ought to have some familiarity with that. I mean, if you want to be a writer, read a lot of books. If you want to be a newscaster, absorb yourself completely in news. If you want to be a filmmaker, watch films nonstop. And with the proliferation of stuff that's on Hulu and Amazon and Netflix and just through iTunes subscriptions, etc., you have access to a world of film that will blow your mind. more on the teaching side and what I like about teaching next week. Right now, let's do some news. You probably didn't know that Booster Gold movie was in production. I was kind of surprised about this last week when I was digging around and saw that Zack Stentz, the writer of X-Men First Class and Thor, wrote a script for Booster Gold a long time ago. Greg Berlanti of Arrow and The Flash and the whole Arrowverse on the CW is tapped to produce and direct. No word on who might star in this because we're still waiting for Warner Brothers and DC Comics to go ahead and give the green light. But apparently this script has been in waiting just for the studios to go, okay, yeah, let's do this. I think that's pretty amazing. That's a different subculture. Define what you mean by a different subculture. Are you just talking about Quentin Tarantino movies, or are you just talking about people's interest in film in general? Boys in the Hood is another one, yeah. I mean, it's a different actor, but I mean, when you look at Singleton and the fact that here is a black director, first-time movie, gets nominated for an Oscar. I think he won for the Oscar, right? That is phenomenally exciting and interesting, and anyone who would want to be an indie filmmaker should be absorbing what these other people have done before them so that you then have an idea of where you can progress after that. Oh, Tarantino versus Singleton. I mean, that's a whole different conversation that we could have another time. There are some things that really bothered me as I watched Pulp Fiction, which I haven't watched that movie in probably 20 years, and watching Jackie Brown again for probably the first time in 20 years. There's some things that bothered me in the terms of language and some other stuff that in hindsight at the time I was like, oh yeah, this is really cool. But in hindsight, I'm like, yeah, I wonder if there's some other issues going on, especially, and that's one of the things that you can see once you look at a body of work by a particular director or a writer or cinematographer or whatever. Are there themes and elements that continue to run out, and what does that tell you about the creator? Hey, remember the Sonic the Hedgehog movie? Remember that awful Sonic the Hedgehog that people were all up in arms about from that first trailer that had people just reeling in horror? Well, director Jeff Fowler sent out a tweet the other day and says, hey, you know what? Actually, when the trailer came out, he said, okay, we hear you. We understand that you all hate this design. We want to make it right for you. And so today, he tweeted out 2/14/20. Basically, what's happening with the Sonic movie is they are pushing the release date back by, I think, 3 months from what it was supposed to be. From November 8th of 2019 to Valentine's Day of 2020. I don't know if the Valentine's Day is supposed to be, hey, we heart you, fans of the Sonic the Hedgehog property. But Jeff Fowler came out and said, you know what, we understand that you guys were not liking this character design at all. We're going to go back and we're going to fix this. We're going to fix the whole movie so that Sonic looks good and that you all like it. Give us a little bit more time. And I find that incredibly fascinating. I find that change in a production just incredibly fascinating. Now, I know we could go into a discussion on why this is bad for the people creating Sonic, who have to now go back and rebuild Sonic, make it look better, the artists that have to go in and re-render everything, all the compositors that have to go back in and recomposite everything. The good thing is, and of course the labor and the extra pressure and people getting burned out and people losing a lot of money on this, we could have a conversation on that. But part of the good thing is, everything's been shot up, everything has been shot and composited and everything from the 3D side, so it may be as simple as replacing, especially if Sonic continues to have the same hair and the same physics, you might be able to just swap out the models. I know there's a little bit more than that. I'm being very reductive on it. But it's not going to be, we have to reanimate this entire character. We can take the mouth movements and we can slap it on the new model. We can take the hair and everything and slap it on the new model. We can re-render everything out and then just replace those files in the compositing, depending on how they've composited it. Should be able to just go in and replace that beginning set of files, those beginning set of renders, and all the other compositing work should just stack right on top of that, and there shouldn't be a lot of extra work that has to happen. But they're giving them 3 months, an extra 3 months before the release of this movie to ensure that it's done right. But beyond that, there is a fascinating conversation about how much control do you, the end user, have on the end work? How much do you have control over the end work? And apparently for I'm just looking at another chat here real quick. Yes, the sound isn't going to be in sync with the other one because there is a delay. The delay to where you guys are at is near zero over in this other chat, in the secret chat. So yes, that's why we're only sending you the audio file, which is fine. But how much control do you as a consumer have over the creation of the art? And this always is kind of bothered me just a little bit. We're not going to take phone calls this week. Let me go over to wherever the heck Skyperton is. I'm not going to take phone calls this week. In fact, let me just shut that down. Because this takes me over to a very fast... I think artists are supposed to create the art, and then once it's released into the wild, then the consumer can react to it. And not that the artist should be creating for the end consumer. I mean, the end consumer should always be in mind. But art becomes very different when I'm sitting here and saying, I'm going to create this specifically for you, and I'm only going to do Finally Friday to talk about content and issues that only you are concerned about. And I won't do anything that is of interest to me or a topic that I think is something that you guys should talk about. That makes art very, very different. And I follow Chuck Wendig, I think that's how you say his name, on Twitter. And he posted a very long, interesting conversation. You can follow this at Chuck Wendig, Wenidg. And he had a very interesting thread this past week that I found fascinating, or a couple of weeks ago. This had to do with the petitioning of whatever movie that people were mad about. I don't know if it was the Robert Pattinson thing or the Game of Thrones. I think it was from Game of Thrones. And Chuck says, on fan petition, two things are simultaneously true. The audience does not control the art because art is not a democracy, which is true. But also the artist ceases to control the art once it is with the audience and cannot control the audience's response, reaction, and handling of that art. I think that is so true, especially in light of when that first Sonic trailer came out, where the artist created something that they thought that they believed in. They thought that they had created a Sonic that looked good, but the audience couldn't tell the artist how to make that Sonic ahead of time. Once the studio released that and everyone could look at that, that is when the audience had a reaction and had a meltdown. And he goes on. It's a very long, interesting thread. There's one more. Let me find this in this long question. He mentions his fan petition, also fan entitlement. You bet you are right. I'm actually trying to find the other quote that I had here. Oh, here it is. Because art and story is a wiggly fiddly thing, you can't just acquiesce to fan demands, because fan demands are a herd of hallucinogenic addled cats. They're running in every GD direction, swiping at invisible things, chasing illusionary birds, staring at their own paws for hours. And that is the weird thing too, right? If you do acquiesce, in the case of the studio, going in and said, yeah, we need to go in and change this, or fans aren't going to like this at all. What are you changing? Are you listening to every fan demand? Are you listening to just the big demand of, hey, Sonic doesn't look good, change this? Or are you going to acquiesce and say, you know what, that one particular episode of Game of Thrones that everyone hated, or everyone hated how the show ended, and whoever's sitting on the throne now, the fans all hate that because they all had their favorites. You can't acquiesce to every fan demand because then there'd be 13 people sitting on a throne. The character who died in season 1 would have come back or never died. And that wouldn't be true to what the art that was created by George R.R. Martin and the creators of Game of Thrones, and so on and so forth. Now, I think the story, the trailer of the Sonic movie, just the story doesn't sound good at all. But you don't see people going back and saying, hey, and also make sure that this story is really good. No, they just want their Sonic to look good and not make it look like a horrifying mess. I like what Kevin is saying in the chat. You can't make everyone happy, and that is absolutely true. No matter what you do, you're going to make someone angry. Even when, going back and bringing this back around to teaching class, I can have two students that sit next to each other in class that I don't know if they have any other classes with one another or not, but I can have two students that sit next to each other the entire semester in my class, and when it comes time to provide feedback to the instructor, which I enjoy feedback, whether you're giving it to me via an email at podcast@majorspoilers.com or whether, you're sending it to me in a tweet or whatever that may be. I enjoy feedback, or whether it's a student giving me feedback of what they liked or don't like. But I can have two students sit in my class the entire semester, and one of them will say, this is the best instructor I have ever had. This person is, I've got a letter from one of the students right here from this last semester. I can have a student write in and say, thank you for your awesome semester. It's been a great experience learning from you and my peers, and thank you for all you've done for us. And it goes on and on and on. Maybe I'll talk about this next week. Then simultaneously, the student sitting right next to the one that had nothing but glowing positive things to say will go in and say, this is the worst instructor that I've ever had. You can't make everyone happy, but you can make nearly everyone mad. Yes, I do get that, Greyhawk. But you're not going to be able to make everyone happy. And so whether you are a company that is looking at making changes to a movie to appease a group, or maybe there's a whole set of fandoms that are upset because Rose Tico is one of your heroes and Rose Tico doesn't look or act like your traditional character that you might see in a Star Wars movie. But they don't get to go back and say, hey, you need to go out and digitally remove her and replace her with someone else because we don't like her. Fans don't have the right to say, we're upset because of the way you took the direction. They have the right to say, we are upset about this or we don't like this, but they can't demand that a company go back and change all of this stuff because you won't be able to fix everything. If you've listened, for example, if you've listened to this week's Dueling Review podcast, the Star Wars Age of the Rebellion Jabba the Hutt #1, you know that I went into nerd territory for just a moment when I had a problem with the art in one panel. And I pointed out why some people are going to have a problem with this one panel of art. But you know what? In the greater scheme of things, it doesn't add or detract from the story. And I'm not going back in and demanding that Marvel go in and correct that one panel and make it accurate to dialogue that was said over 40 years ago. Because in the long run, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't affect my enjoyment of that entire issue. And I understand, for some people it will. But let the artist create. Once it's released, then make your judgments. We had this conversation last week over the Robert Pattinson thing. He might be a fantastic Bruce Wayne. He may be the best Bruce Wayne you've ever seen. You don't know until you've seen a trailer or until you've seen the entire movie. And even then, trailers are not a good representation of how the movie is going to be. We all looked at the Detective Pikachu, and we thought this was going to be really great. It turns out the story's maybe not as good as people think it is. But wait until the artist has released the work, and then judge it. Maybe we should talk more about artists versus corporations at another time, but I think that is where we are. Oh, I've got one more thing to do. Let's jump into some emails. And of course, you can send me emails at podcast@majorspoilers.com. I enjoy reading your feedback. Here's one from Sean. Sean says, apparently my brother who works at a movie theater in Lawrence has met Matthew. It never ceases to amaze me how small the world actually is. In fact, as I lived in Lawrence for a fair number of years back in the late 90s and was an avid gamer, it's quite possible I met Matthew somewhere along the way as well. I worked at the Weird Images crew for a bit at cons, if that rings any bells, and hung out with KU gamers. I know this is a random email, but there is definitely something about Kansas that lends itself to gaming, and as always, thank you for sharing your adventures. This is probably talking about Critical Hit. You may have met Matthew. I mean, Matthew does go to Lawrence. He doesn't live in Lawrence. In the late 90s, he would have been in Topeka. Well, he actually may have still been in Hayes, actually. So maybe you met him, but maybe not. So that's an interesting one from Sean. I find this fascinating when people are like, oh, it's a small world. Yes, I find it fascinating that Jason Inman is also from Kansas, probably about an hour from where I grew up. So, yeah, it is a small world after all. Malone says, since when did people become so delusional they actually think entitled to demand something like that? Well, again, that becomes in the larger conversation of entitlement, whether it be student entitlement of, I've shown up to class, I did the minimum amount of work, I deserve an A, or give me an A. And it's like, well, you did the minimum amount of work. That's a C. You didn't go above and beyond. That's A work is going above and beyond the minimum requirements. Executing a project flawlessly is A work. Turning in something that has bad lighting or bad audio or bad composition or not even edited well, not white balanced correctly, that's not A work. That's average or below average work. So you get the grade that you earn. And I think when it comes to movies and television and other things that you consume in the entertainment field or in the art field or the music field or whatever it may be, you also get that product that you deserve, the end product that you deserve. And when companies start to acquiesce too much and start to put the consumer's interests and expectations above what an artist wants to create, then I think you're going to end up with a product that is not going to be good for anyone. Anyway, those are my 2 cents. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Podcast at majorspoilers.com is where you can write. And like I said, that's where we're going to wrap it up this week. I'd love to read more of your emails on this show. So if you would, podcast at majorspoilers.com. I think we've got a lot of some good chatter going on in the chat. I want to see more of that as the weeks go on. I know we're rolling into a 3-day weekend, so maybe there may be a fewer people than normal, but we should be good to go through all of June for every Friday, except for, I know that first week in July, we won't have a Finally Friday, but from here on out till the end of June, we should be Finally Friday every single week. I can't wait to have you part of the show, and I can't wait to have you send in your comments and thoughts and ideas and see you show up in the chat next time. But until next time, have a wonderful holiday. If you are in the United States, please be safe, and we will talk with you next time when it's finally Friday. Look at all those fantastic people. Shadow Tiger, the murderous penguin who lives in my sock drawer, Zach, Alex. I don't know. There's a long one in there. Somebody running for Congress or something. Brian, Bruce, Brian, Chris, Christopher, Claire, Clay, Cody, Corey. So good to see so many of you there. Thank you for all of your support. Again, if you want to find out how you can help us out, patreon.com/majorspoilers.